Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you're joining us from. My name is Deanne Cameron. I'm the head of the Nuclear Technology Development and Economics Division at the Nuclear Energy Agency, and it's my pleasure today to open today's event. Welcome to the third webinar in our series on financing nuclear energy projects. We began in January with a kickoff event that identified key opportunities and challenges in financing nuclear new builds, followed by an event in the month of May on financing small modular reactors. Today's event will focus on taxonomies and ESG, environmental, social, and governance financing. Our series will continue in September with events on contractual structures and incentives, as well as a workshop on development and climate finance and risk management for nuclear energy projects. All building towards our capstone event in 2022 in collaboration with the government of Poland, an in-person conference in Warsaw on nuclear financing, where we hope to see you in person, an event that will bring together all of the themes we began to explore throughout this webinar series. The time is right to be exploring these topics as countries are seeking to build back better following the pandemic. With a renewed focus on climate change mitigation and adaptation, there is a growing recognition that nuclear is playing already an important role and could play even a larger role, not just as a technical solution to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, but also we have to face the policy challenges, including the financial policy challenges to reach our goals. Clean energy financing and financial policy challenges have been identified as one of the major themes for COP26 by the UK government as it prepares to host COP26 in Glasgow later this year. During our webinar today, we'll hear from experts around the world in sustainable finance. As a testament to the importance of these topics, today's event represents a collaboration amongst three international organizations: the Nuclear Energy Agency, an international organization of 34 member countries under the umbrella of the OECD; IFNEC, the International Framework for Nuclear Energy Cooperation, with 65 participating countries, including nuclear power generating countries, as well as many new countries considering embarking with nuclear power generation and SMRs to meet their future energy needs in a low carbon future. As well as the Generation 4 International Forum, 13 countries plus the European Union working together on R&D for next generation nuclear innovations. I'd like now to introduce today's moderator. Paul Murphy is the founder and managing director of Murphy Energy and Infrastructure Consulting. Paul focuses on multiple aspects of the nuclear industry, from legal and policy matters, including international regulatory and treaty frameworks, and issues regarding nuclear liability, to strategies for creating financing, nuclear power programs, and the identification and mitigation of associated risks. Representing governments, developers, owners, investors, lenders, and contractors on nuclear projects internationally. Paul regularly teaches financing, contracting, and project development for the IAEA, for Argonne National Laboratories, Texas A&M University, and he serves as a guest lecturer in the U.S. National Defense University and at Virginia Tech. He has served as a 6-time appointee to the U.S. Secretary of Commerce's Civilian Nuclear Trade Advisory Committee, and he has served on ASME's Clean Energy Technology Advisory Panel. He's also an affiliate of the Nuclear Economics Consulting Group. I have the pleasure to introduce Paul. I've known Paul for many years now, and we have worked together on some very interesting initiatives. One in particular comes to mind. Paul, I don't know if you'll remember this one. It was one of the first workshops that brought together Canada's nuclear sector with Canada's mining and oil sands sectors for a discussion on the potential applications of nuclear innovation, in particular SMRs and nuclear heat, to heavy industry in the context of our objectives around deep decarbonization. And that event helped shape the direction of Canada's SMR roadmap and action plan. Paul, I share this with you because I want you to know that Paul has a knack for building bridges across sectors, bringing the nuclear industry together with strategic partners from other industries, from mining and heavy industry, and of course, from finance, which is what brings us together today. So it's with great pleasure that I hand over the floor to my friend and colleague, Paul. I look forward to our continuing collaborations. The floor is yours.
Deanne, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Greetings to everyone from Kauai in the Hawaiian Islands. It's middle of the night here, but it is an honor to be with you. And I wanted to thank NEA and IFNEC for inviting me to serve on this panel. About a year and a half ago, I was part of a feasibility study for SMRs for the island of Puerto Rico, and I would love to say that I'm here in Hawaii looking to develop SMRs. That would obviously be my dream job, but that's not exactly why I'm here, but thanks anyway. We have 5 great speakers for you today. The way the session's going to work is each of our speakers will have about 10 minutes for some opening remarks. Then we'll talk amongst ourselves for about 20 minutes. We'll open it up to questions from all the attendees and take questions for about another 20 minutes. So please feel free to use the Q&A function on your browser to submit any questions that you might have as we go forward, and we'll try and address as many of those as we can in the time allotted. And then we'll close out with Deanne's final comments. Just to start things off, I think it's fair to say that we find ourselves in interesting times. I mean, we're very aware that climate change is not some future challenge, but it's a clear and present challenge that we're faced today. And at the same time, while we think that we're in the midst of recovering from COVID, you know, a lot of places in the world are still fighting COVID and are deeply in the midst of COVID. And what's interesting about that is that governments are looking to implement policies to recover from the pandemic and its impacts at multiple levels. And, you know, one of the issues is as funds become available, how should they be used? We see companies that have become, you know, under scrutiny by activist investors and others that are looking at how their portfolios support climate change and clean energy goals. And we see ourselves also in a time where the world continues to need to develop for the good of the world's population. And when we layer in the concept of climate change, we see the need for clean growth strategies. So when you put all this together, labels start to become important to this discussion. And the focus for today is really going to be about that combination of taxonomy and whether or not nuclear fits into that clean energy label. And then also the idea of ESG investing and how nuclear might be a part of it, because we see that there are a lot of recognized bodies out there that have identified nuclear as a crucial piece for addressing the world's needs, but we see that is not unanimously held. So how that impacts the discussion of taxonomy and ESG investing is something that people are talking about now and are issues that are being dealt with now. And we hope to address those for you today. So without further ado, we can jump right into the agenda, and I'll introduce each of the speakers as we go. And our first speaker is Jessica Johnson. And Jessica is the Communications and EU Stakeholders Director at Foratom based in Belgium. And for those of you that don't know, Foratom is the trade association which represents the nuclear industry at the European level. She is also in charge of all sustainability matters, in particular the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. She joined the organization in October 2017, prior to which she was the Communications Director of the Trade Association representing the cement industry, where she also dealt with biodiversity and general circular economy matters. A British national, she grew up in Spain and has now been living in Belgium for more than 20 years. So it's with great pleasure that I turn the floor over to Jessica Johnson. Jessica.
Thank you very much, Paul. Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak during this very relevant event. My introductory remarks are really going to focus on the taxonomy, which is currently being developed at EU level, and the status of nuclear within that taxonomy. So just for those of you who may not be aware, the EU taxonomy, its main goal is to try and direct investments towards projects and activities which can be considered as sustainable. And for the time being, the taxonomy focuses on the environmental pillar of sustainability. They are looking to deal more with the social pillar, but that's more in future. As a result, the current formulation of the taxonomy covers 6 environmental objectives. First of all, they're looking at activities which significantly contribute to either climate change mitigation or climate adaptation, and which at the same time do no significant harm to these 4 remaining criteria. So those relating to water and marine resources, the circular economy, pollution prevention and control, and the protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. Within this work that's been taken so far, there was a technical experts group set up by the Commission to look at how different technologies could fit within the taxonomy and whether they could be deemed as taxonomy compliant. When it came to nuclear, the technical experts group was very divided. And as a result, they essentially concluded that they didn't actually have the right expertise to assess nuclear. And so they recommended that the Commission mandate a group of experts with an in-depth knowledge of the nuclear life cycle to undertake such an assessment. And in particular, one of the areas that I had questions about were those relating to the deep geological repositories and the management of high-level waste. So following on from that, the Commission decided, okay, so at this stage, we don't include nor do we exclude nuclear, but we will mandate these different groups of experts to undertake the necessary assessment to see what can be done with nuclear in the future under the taxonomy. The first group is the JRC. Now, this is a joint research centre, which is a unit linked to the European Commission and which is composed of nuclear experts. They came out with their report in March of this year. And according to their report, they said that the analysis didn't reveal any scientific-based evidence that nuclear does more harm to human health or to the environment than other electricity production technologies, which are already deemed to be as taxonomy compliant and supporting climate change mitigation. They also, further to the query raised by the TEG, concluded that deep geological repositories are considered an appropriate and safe solution for the management of high-level radioactive waste. As a result of this, the JRC concluded that nuclear is in fact taxonomy compliant. Once this report was made available, the work was then handed over to 2 additional expert groups so that they could submit opinions on the work undertaken by the JRC. The first of these was the SHEA. So the Scientific Committee on Health, Environmental and Emerging Risks. Broadly speaking, the SHEA agreed with the conclusions of the JRC. However, within their report, or within their opinion, they did raise a few questions. Part of these questions is related to this point that they make very clear in their opinion, that first of all, they were asked to focus just on the JRC report, and they themselves could not conduct an additional assessment. So areas where they may have had some more questions, they were unable to look at additional studies and additional research to see whether that would answer them. A second point that they also make clear, and which impacts some of their results, is the fact that they didn't have enough time to bring on board additional experts to help them with, for example, the assessment of deep geological repositories. Because in actual fact, the 2 expert groups were given a maximum of 3 months in order to put forward their opinions. And of course, in the case of the SHEA, which is composed of a broad range of experts in the fields of toxicology, doctors, environmental matters, etc. In some areas, they would have liked to have a bit more time to do some additional work and ask for other experts to support them. What they did raise as a query is that they weren't sure that the do no significant harm criteria, which are those I referred earlier and which are actually included under the taxonomy regulation, are enough to ensure that an activity does not cause harm, particularly an activity outside of the EU. So here they were raising a question as to whether we can be certain that mining activities outside of Europe don't cause environmental harm. But of course, this question in a way relates not just to nuclear, it also relates to other technologies, particularly those that are very dependent on raw materials which are extracted outside of Europe. And that's why it's important to bear in mind that here their question is more about the criteria from the taxonomy than being a question about nuclear itself. With regards to the knowledge gaps, they indicated that they didn't actually have the time to look into the question whether there are any gaps in the knowledge. So it's coming back to this point that they would have liked to look at other studies, but the 3 months just didn't give them the time to do that. The second expert group was the one that is called the Article 31 group. So this stems from the Euratom Treaty, and it is composed of experts in radio protection. So really this is the second group of experts with an in-depth knowledge of the nuclear life cycle. Their conclusions confirm that the JRC work is accurate. They believe that in terms of public health and environmental protection, the existing legal framework is more than adequate. And then for activities outside of Europe, they think there is enough EU legislation and international recommendations and standard to make sure that these do not cause significant harm. They agreed with the JRC that deep geological repositories are appropriate, safe, and considered as an existing technology. And that on the point about the precautionary principle, they think that this is managed perfectly by the existing legislation. They were able to answer the question as to whether there was any gaps in the knowledge. And what they raise is that they think that the JRC work is based on well-established scientific research and that any gaps are unlikely to change the conclusions. But what they do say is that nuclear, like with all fields, you can always do more research, but that this shouldn't necessarily be seen as a gap in the knowledge. So now we have all the nuclear assessment, which was completed at the beginning of July. So I just wanted to give a brief update on where we stand in terms of whether nuclear is going to be included or not under the taxonomy. What the Commission has already made clear is that they are going to be spending the summer reviewing the different assessments, i.e. the work of the JRC and the two opinions. Based on their internal review, it will then be up to the Commission to decide whether or not to add nuclear to what is called a complementary delegated act. The reason why it is complementary is because a first delegated act covering the other technologies has already been sent to the Parliament and Council for approval. If the Commission does decide to add nuclear to this so-called complementary delegated act, then the process that will be followed is, first of all, they will publish a draft, which includes technical screening criteria based upon those in the JRC report. The public will then have 1 month to submit their comments on this draft. They will finalize that draft and then they send it for what we call scrutiny. When we talk scrutiny, it means that it goes to the Council and the European Parliament, which have 4 + 2 months to either adopt or reject the complementary delegated act. They cannot amend it. What do we think is going to happen next? Well, unfortunately, it's a question of having a crystal ball, to be honest with you, because the issue is an extremely political one, particularly at EU level, because whilst there are a lot of member states that are very supportive of nuclear and which have made it clear that without nuclear, there is no way they can achieve the ambitious targets which the EU has set in terms of emission reductions, there are several other member states, most notably Austria, Luxembourg, and Germany, who strongly believe that nuclear must not form part of the taxonomy because in their opinion, it is not sustainable. So the question that we have today is really, what is the Commission going to do next? And we do still have some concerns that even if the science backs the fact that nuclear can be considered as sustainable and thus taxonomy compliant, it may still be excluded from the taxonomy for political reasons, unfortunately. Thank you.
Jessica, thank you so much for those opening remarks. It's really helpful to set the tone for the remainder of our discussion. We're now going to turn the floor to a friend of mine who I've known for well over a decade, Fiona Riley, who is the Managing Director of Fire Energy Limited. Fiona is an energy and infrastructure specialist with over 25 years of experience encompassing nuclear, oil and gas, renewables, and thermal power. She's often involved in large-scale energy and infrastructure projects, particularly the development, structuring, international regulatory development, compliance, and licensing and financing. In 2018, she chaired the Expert Finance Working Group on Small Reactors for UK government and produced the Market Framework for Financing Small Nuclear, which is a very influential publication, and it's something that a lot of people internationally look to for guidance on financing small reactors. She now sits on the Generation 4 International Forum as the UK representative and co-chairs the EMWG. She's also a strategic advisory board member of the Nuclear Industry Association and of Untitled Nuclear. So it's with great pleasure I now turn the floor to Fiona Riley. Fiona.
Thanks, Paul, for that all-encompassing introduction. He failed to mention that we're both lawyers who've moved away from the law, which probably says something about the direction of the legal industry these days. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to talk about the work we're doing through the Gen 4 Forum and the paper that we're producing looking at nuclear as an investable asset class. We put together a task force of mainly financiers and a few policy people, but mainly financiers, to look at how nuclear reports against ESG metrics, but we've also considered taxonomy in the discussions a little bit. So I thought I'd draw the distinction between taxonomies and ESG metrics first. Taxonomies we see as broad policy documents, and therefore, if you look at the various taxonomies around the world that are either currently existent, being debated, like the EU one, or countries looking to draft them, or even countries who are considering not having taxonomies and simply saying, let's have greater ESG reporting, should be the way I'd go. The policy frameworks vary considerably. So some are very prescriptive as to which technologies fall in or out of the taxonomy, and others set frameworks. We have a firm belief that the taxonomy should have a broad framework because they are high-level policy documents. If you then apply the ESG metrics to that, ESG are data collection and assessment metrics, and they have been developed by the finance industry for countries who want any form of private financing, regardless of what sector they sit in, how that private financing comes in, how you look at those companies, how they report against ESG metrics, and therefore in their reporting, looking at a balanced scorecard, whether they should have access to climate financing. Now, the challenge we have is that to date, there hasn't been a common set of ESG metrics. There are lots of different organizations who created their own set of metrics. And in fact, each finance community or each finance body has its own set of metrics within its own institution. So it's become very difficult for companies to learn to report against these metrics when there's no consistency. So having said that, the UN's Principle of Responsible Investment have set out principles linked to the broad concept of ESG metrics, and that companies who want to access climate financing, of which most financing is these days, should sign up to these principles and should agree to have the adoption of ESG metrics. There are nearly 4,000 investors who've signed up to the UN's Principles of Responsible Investment, which covers over 1.5 trillion US dollars. So they are leading the way on saying ESG reporting is the way forward. So you've got all these institutions saying ESG is the way forward, but we didn't have a common set of metrics. Last year, the World Economic Forum issued a consultation suggesting a common set of metrics, and they reported on that consultation. The consultation was drafted by the Big Four accounting firms and others, and they fall into 4 pillars. The 4 pillars are governance, planet, people, and prosperity. And what we're doing through the Gen 4 Forum is looking at nuclear as an asset class, so not as individual companies, but broadly saying, can nuclear report well against each and every one of those metrics? And the simple answer is yes, it can. Some are very company specific, so how you set up your company. Some look at the industry more generally. So if we start with the excuse me, we start with the governance metrics. They cover Does the company have a strong governing purpose? Do the board stick to that governing purpose? Have they drifted away from it? What's the quality of the governing body? Is there diversity? Is there inclusion? Is there diversity of thinking? Does the board engage well with its a wide and broad range of stakeholders? And does it behave ethically? And does it provide good risk oversight for the company? They're pretty company specific, but they need to be recognized because these not only look at the individual company, but flow throughout the supply chain, helping that company develop its assets. We then move into the planet, which links to some of the taxonomy questions that Jessica was talking about. So climate change and waste. How do companies manage their waste? How does the industry manage their waste? And I think that's a really interesting one for the nuclear industry because yes, we have nuclear waste, but you know what? We manage it exceptionally well. We lead the world on managing waste. And if you compare it with some other low carbon technologies, they don't manage their waste anywhere near as well as the nuclear industry. And that needs to be recognized. And I think that's one of the important points for ESG metrics over taxonomies is you can really dig into, excuse the pun, how companies manage their waste and how they deal with it and mitigate it and make the most of it in some instances. I'm doing some work on medical isotopes, and I recently found out we get some medical isotopes from nuclear waste. So why aren't we making more of this, guys? These are really important to the countries and social governance and economic improvement. But the World Economic Forum doesn't stop with just climate change and waste. It also looks at nature loss. So if you compare a small nuclear reactor against a wind farm or a solar farm, it will not surprise you that a small nuclear reactor takes up much less room than a large solar farm or a large wind farm. We also look at the use of water, pollution, and also the resources used. And it's interesting when you get into the detail, and the report is very, very long, I'm afraid. It's now 180 pages, but the pollution created by nuclear is far lower than that of wind and solar. The metrics then look at people. And the first is dignity and equality, how you deal with your workforce, how you look at your supply chain. Is there any child labor in your supply chain? Because sadly, there still is in some technologies. Do you have diversity of your supply chain? It then goes into health and well-being, health and safety. And we've taken some metrics from the TCFD and the SASB metrics, which include some very nuclear health and safety criteria. But it also looks for skills for the future. Are we developing a future of our industry? Are we creating innovation? Are we bringing people into the industry? How are we looking forward? How do we create a future for our apprentices, for people wanting to move into this industry? And the final area is prosperity, which is the wider socio-economic development arising from that asset. What wealth creation are we creating for the region and for the country? Is the energy affordable? What's its end use efficiency? What's the grid resiliency? Is there innovation? And this is always a challenging one for governments because that includes R&D spend, but not R&D spend funded by governments. R&D spend is funded by the companies themselves. So again, investing in their own future, are they looking forward? And also the community and social vitality, which includes, are you paying your taxes? Are you giving back to the community? So we've developed a very long report because it goes into a huge amount of detail on all of those metrics across the nuclear asset class. The main body of the report is a very positive case for the nuclear industry and shows how well nuclear as an asset class can report against each and every one of those metrics and draws some challenges for other technologies. And the back end of the report really goes into detail and feeds across to NEA reports, Canadian Nuclear Association reports, Nuclear Industry Association reports. And we're hoping the report will be used as a Bible for anybody looking at the nuclear industry going forward and whether climate financing should be accepted and should be able to be brought into nuclear assets. I'll leave it there. I'm sure people will have questions on some of those areas, but we can come to those. Thanks, Paul.
Fiona, thanks so much for those remarks, and I'm sure we're going to touch on a bit of that in the Q&A as well. So thank you so much. Our next speaker is Babatunde Alatazu, who is the Senior Research Associate for Sustainability at the Conference Board of Canada. Tunde leads research on small modular nuclear reactors, where he has chaired projects and convenings relative to finance, economic impact, and other strategic issues facing SMRs in Canada. He served on the federal government's SMR Roadmap Committee, you heard Deanne mention that before, and the SMR Economic and Finance Working Group. He received a PhD from the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Alberta, and he has a master's degree in mechanical engineering from Brunel University in England. Babatunde, the floor is yours.
Thanks indeed for the introduction, much appreciated. It's my sincere pleasure to be here today to talk about taxonomies, ESG, the role of nuclear more generally as it pertains to the net zero, climate change, carbon neutrality agenda by 2050. My sincere thanks to the OECD, NEA, and IFNEC for convening this important conversation. It's quite timely, I would add. It's also timely for us here at the Conference Board of Canada, given the fact that we're actually working on the nexus between sustainable finance and nuclear energy more broadly. So in that light, I'd like to give a shout out to my colleague, Dr. Jesse Steinberg, who's collaborating with me and working on this initiative together. So my comments today will focus exclusively on small modular nuclear reactors. And in particular, I'll focus on the pre-commercial side of things. The fact that indeed small modular nuclear reactors are positioned as the future of nuclear energy, but many of these technologies are still in the emerging phase. So what does financing look like from that standpoint, and how does that connect to the ESG taxonomy conversation? Because I think that's important if these technologies are going to be positioned to get us to net zero by 2050. So let me talk a little bit about some context setting. Let me talk about the fact that nuclear energy is in many ways powering a new consensus regarding the decarbonization or our journey to net zero. I think it's clear that the consensus, it really says in very clear terms that nuclear energy is indeed critical, essential, instrumental to get into carbon neutrality globally. And this is echoed by important institutions, important individuals. And I'll just give a quote from two individuals here to just highlight the point. First, you have the International Energy Agency Executive Director Fatih Birol, who recently said, wind and solar energy need to play a much greater role in order for countries to meet sustainability goals, but it's extremely difficult to envision them doing so without help from nuclear power, right? And closer to home here in Canada, our Honorable Minister for Natural Resources in Canada recently, said the following: we have not seen a model where we can get to net zero emissions, by 2050 without nuclear energy. So I think it's pretty clear cut that indeed, if we're serious about decarbonization, net zero, carbon neutrality, nuclear energy has an instrumental role to play. So if we take this, newfound consensus that nuclear energy is powering at the moment, and we combine that with the renaissance in nuclear innovation that we're seeing as it pertains to small modular nuclear reactors, and SMRs, as many of you know, have a number of advantages relative to the larger reactor technologies. For instance, they have, expected to have a reduced, construction timelines. You also have a lot more flexibility in how you can site these reactors. They're improved economics, improved environmental footprint in terms of, the use of non-water coolants, etc. And also, the waste footprint is smaller simply because you have a smaller, reactor, right? So if you combine this newfound consensus and you combine that with the renaissance in nuclear innovation with SMRs, the nuclear industry, at least logically, if you think about it, is really primed to make a significant comeback. And then let me add a third layer here and talk about the fact that there's significant appetite in the private sector for environmental, social, and governance aligned investments, for technology development that actually moves forward, our environmental, social governance agenda. So if I focus on the environment side of things, again, highlighting the fact that net zero, get into carbon neutrality by 2050, I think there's broad consensus that nuclear energy is instrumental. You would think that indeed we will be seeing a lot of activity from the private sector, particularly to position small modular nuclear reactors for deployment so that they can help get us to that net zero, carbon neutral future that we all agree that it's a significant priority. But when we just take a look at the actual flow of capital, it's a different story that is being told. And really what I want to highlight here is the fact that, if we take a look at the investors in the private sector that have a particular appetite for high risk investments, so for instance, venture capital investment, right, as an example of this, we notice that there are a couple of things that are instructive here. First and foremost, and this is a graph for the US, what we notice, and this is a period of over 9 years, what we notice is that the energy sector is increasingly a negligible aspect of venture capital investment. We're just not seeing the level of appetite, level of interest, that we should be seeing, given the fact that we increasingly recognize that, the future of our planet is at stake. And indeed, we need to decarbonize, and we need to decarbonize rapidly. So what we're seeing, despite, the high priority that climate change, carbon neutrality has gotten, is a retrenchment really from the private sector, a retreat from the private sector, precisely at the time when we actually need that investment in those technologies that can decarbonize our economies, right? As you can see here in 2020, energy sector investments from the venture side of things only amounted to about 1% of the total venture investments. And this is obviously US data, and we're talking about venture capital specifically here. Now, if I move on, you might think that, okay, this is a US issue, but in Canada, this is a similar story. And again, granted that this is a North American example again, but it just highlights the point that we're really not seeing, particularly from the venture capital sector, the level of investment, the level of appetite that is really needed to get technologies such as SMRs in the energy sector, right, to get them to the point whereby they can be deployed and decarbonize and get us to net zero by 2050. So essentially, what I like to highlight is that there's really a gap. There's a gap between the rhetoric and the pronouncements of governments and multilateral institutions regarding the instrumental role that nuclear will play to getting us to net zero, and the flow of finance to position nuclear innovation, SMR technologies to decarbonize our economies, right? On average, and this is based on work that we have done at the conference board in engaging with nuclear stakeholders and the sustainable finance community, on average, you need about $500 million to $1 billion of investment to get small modular nuclear reactor technology ready for that commercialization, ready for that first of a kind deployment. Venture capital is largely absent from this, and venture capital really, in many ways, is not a strong fit for nuclear, given the fact that the development timelines of nuclear are longer than venture capitalists would prefer. I mean, you have investment portfolios where venture capitalists are looking to exit with maybe between 3 to 5 years. Nuclear energy, there's no the small modular nuclear reactors. You don't have any revenue until you actually get to the first of a kind build. So there are many attributes that make venture capital investments not really a good fit for nuclear. And then to maybe add a little bit more complexity to this is that some venture capitalist funds increasingly, there is ESG criteria, exclusion criteria in venture capitalist funds. Increasingly, we see that these funds also exclude nuclear. And in fact, many of them categorize nuclear alongside, business activities with questionable ethics. So things like defense weapons, tobacco, pornography, etc. And this is based on, really entrenched, longstanding perceptions about nuclear energy. And I think that the categorization of nuclear energy in this, bucket of business activities really needs to be challenged, especially given the fact that, we all agree that, like I mentioned earlier, there's broad consensus that nuclear energy has an instrumental role to play in getting us to net zero. So that categorization of nuclear, needs to be challenged. And this is where I think taxonomies will play a helpful role in defining indeed what is sustainable, what exactly, are the sorts of economic activities we should be supporting in a given economy. So let me proceed by saying, fine, if we're noticing that we're not getting a lot of interest, there's not a lot of investment flow from the venture capitalist community, well, where is the money coming from for nuclear, in particular SMRs, at this pre-commercial phase? And in answering that question, we're noticing that there's actually quite a significant activity in terms of family offices that are actually providing this early stage private capital for SMR development. In our engagement with a number of nuclear vendors, family offices dominate their sources of private capital in terms of how much they've been able to raise. cumulatively vendors, and these are mainly the SME type nuclear vendors of the startup companies, if you will, are raising between $10 to $50 million from family office sources. So family offices, when it pertains to ESG, are somewhat more flexible, especially when you're talking about the single family office. There's more flexibility given the fact that their investments are often conditioned and influenced by the preferences of, say, ultra high net worth individuals. So there's somewhat more flexibility regarding ESG. So while we're noticing that indeed there is capital flowing from this niche segment of the financing sector, it's also apparent that this is not sufficient. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, you're noticing that you need, in terms of technology developments, you're getting SMRs to the commercial realm, you need about $500 million to $1 billion in investment. And if you're raising cumulatively about $10 to $50 million, you can realize that there's actually a significant gap that needs to be filled. And that gap needs to come really from governments. Governments traditionally, it's not just in case of SMRs and not just in case of nuclear, but whether you talk about the wind energy industry and the origins of that in the 70s, the solar industry as well, even innovations such as the oil sands, extraction technologies that we have here in Canada, things like steam-assisted gravity drainage technology. My point is that governments have always played a significant role in de-risking, in developing those transformative technologies throughout history. So new SMRs are no different, right? What we will see is that where you have governments with visionary long-term policies, strategies, policy support for nuclear energy, and obviously capital that can de-risk the technologies and get them to the point whereby the risk-return equation for the private sector comes much more palatable, you start to see capital flowing in that direction. So governments have an instrumental role to play in indeed positioning SMRs for deployment and for that decarbonization agenda, like I said, by 2050 to get to carbon neutrality. And this is why science-based taxonomies are really important. And I think the work done by the Joint Research Center really highlights and underscores this point, because increasingly being able to access capital from governments will depend on whether or not the activity that you're involved in is actually considered sustainable, which is why the inclusion.
Babatunde, if you could wrap up, please, that would be great. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Okay, I'll wrap this up really quickly. So essentially, you need to, the nuclear energy industry needs to get to the point whereby it's included in the taxonomies, because this is essential for accessing public capital. And maybe just to close, I'll just mention the fact that the private sector also has a role to play. You need increased transparency from the private sector, and particularly from the vendor side of things, in terms of financing sources, in terms of technology readiness levels. And in general, the private sector also needs to be willing to accept more risk and to carry risk in support of vendors, EPC companies, utilities, etc. I'll leave it there, and thank you for the time.
For those excellent remarks. I'm sure that's going to spur a lot of discussion as we go forward. Our next speaker is Helena Leon, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Rosatom. Ms. Leon has professional expertise in strategic management and policymaking for more than 10 years. She is involved in the development of Russian regulations. She joined Rosatom Group in 2016, and since 2019 is responsible for the sustainability strategy and ESG compliance of the company. Recently, she has taken part in the elaboration of the Russian Green Taxonomy and the development of the climate-focused state instruments, aligning them with international best practices. Paulina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to see all the speakers, and there is quite a lot of people listening. I would kindly ask the support team to help me with the slides, with my slides. Great, thank you very much. I would like to say a few words today about the general idea of the ESG compliance of nuclear energy, and to share with you some news from Russian Federation compliance, because currently we are also working upon the taxonomy and some climate regulation. So next slide, please. First of all, that is quite evident, and we have talked already about that, we know that nuclear energy contributes a lot to the climate challenge nowadays. So you can see that we have here the comparison with wind and hydro and solar, and we see that nuclear basically has quite a good results in regard of its greenhouse gas emissions if we take the whole life cycle. And also if we consider the general effect of all nuclear power plants in the world, we see it's really huge, because it's quite similar to the for example, to the all forests absorption function. So there is really a solid amount of impact. And as for Russia, we see that nuclear, we have about 20% of nuclear share in general country generation. And, you know, Russia, it's quite a big country. So we basically, our key economic facilities, production facilities are located in the European part of Russia. And for this part of territory, we have about 40% of nuclear generations. So you understand that we have to consider this low carbon source of electricity and to qualify it somehow, to verify, to appreciate the low carbon nature of nuclear energy. As for Jessica has mentioned, we have this GRC conclusion which say that nuclear energy does no more harm to the human health and the environment, and that is it does no more harm than any other power producing technology, considering to be sustainable. So we have asked ourselves, how can we consider this sustainability compliance for the nuclear in Russia? So next slide, please. Yes, great. So now, of course, in Russia, we do have developing our country climate and sustainable regulation. It mostly it follows the European one, but we have a very efficient discussion with our Parliament and with our methodology Green Center. And finally, we have agreed that we will have two types of taxonomy in Russia, which the first one is the compliance rules for the green, so-called green projects, and the second one is for transitional projects, because you know that we all countries need to have some kind of transitional period to make this energy shift, this economical shift, so to qualify these transitional projects like mostly sustainable in these circumstances, in these financial and commercial conditions. Finally, after all the discussions, we are happy to know that nuclear energy, I mean the generation facilities mostly, they are going to be qualified as low carbon and green in Russia. And our country methodological center, that is Development Bank of Russia, they said that they cannot comply as a green one the nuclear power plants which would have any compliance of European taxonomy, so they cannot permit this conflict, this methodological conflict before the nuclear energy won't be qualified as a sustainable and green one in Europe. But anyway, the nuclear power generation facilities which are located in Russia or which are performed by Russian companies for Rosatom, they are going to qualify to label them like a green and sustainable one. So so in this way, we're happy to know and waiting for the final decision of the Russian parliament. But anyway, I would like also to mention that Russia is not unique in such a decision and such an idea, because we have a lot of consideration now, a lot of discussions, international discussions with, for example, Chinese climate people and, for example, US climate authorities, which declare that nuclear power is an important part of the climate agenda, to perform the climate goals, to perform the all these net zero goals. So we understand that somehow nuclear energy needs to be qualified as ESG compliant, for example. And also you can see on my slide that we know that Climate Bonds Initiative, that is international paper, it also qualifies nuclear like in a green zone. So that is very important, that Russia is not alone right now with such a decision. And next slide, please. And just to share with you our first experience to combine our climate, sustainability compliance of nuclear with the financial markets. I put here, I provide you with an example of one of our nuclear power plant projects, that is Akkuyu project in Turkey, which Rosatom is built right now. That is 4 units. That is the first nuclear power plant in Turkey, and we are responsible not only for construction but also for financing of this project. And in regard of this ESG financing, these green financing markets, our Russian banks, they asked us if we are interested in, for example, green or ESG compliant financing. And as we still do not have this international green compliance for nuclear power plants, we have performed with the help of these banks, the bank Sovcom Bank and Ankritia, to ESG linked credits for the Akkuyu nuclear power plant. So these 2 deals, they are recently closed. They have ESG covenants, that is about biodiversity and wastewater amount of this power plant, and the supply chain management. So that are 3 basic covenants, and I would say that the financing terms, they're really better, and they're really more interesting than general commercial credits. So I would say that the challenge for nuclear vendors and the challenge for nuclear industry recently, it is to be transparent, to be in dialogue and discussion for these policy-making authorities, and also to think about ESG compliance, not the projects only, but the company as a whole, because there are different levels of requirements in regard of this sustainability. Thank you.
Helena, thank you so much for those remarks. And I have to say, that looks like a beautiful site on the water there in Turkey. Maybe we can all go visit it someday. Wonderful. So following the principle that you can never have too many Murphys at an event, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Daryl Murphy, who is the head of infrastructure real assets at Aviva Investors, and he is responsible for infrastructure transactions for the infrastructure equity and debt strategies at Aviva. He has over 25 years of experience in infrastructure financing and investment. He previously advised the Department for Energy and Climate Change on the financing of Hinkley Point C in the United Kingdom, and has advised Horizon on the development and financing of the Willow project, also in the United Kingdom. He's a member of the UK Nuclear Industry Council as well. So Daryl, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you to everyone, and very, very pleased to be here. As Paul indicates, I have a background in nuclear, but I'm not unique, but I'm relatively unusual, I guess, in that I came from an advisory background. But when I came to be an investor, I was under the misapprehension maybe that I probably wouldn't get to see nuclear again. And then very, very quickly, we find ourselves in the UK very much focused on how private capital can be mobilized into nuclear as a sector. So what I'd like to set out, and I think all the presentations beforehand have sort of led to this, is to give a vantage point from a financial investor. And a lot of the capital, we are an institutional investor, so the capital I speak to is classically long-term pension fund or insurance money. So arguably capital that should align well for both technologies which meet sort of the pathway to net zero and offer investment opportunity. So I want to just provide some thoughts on that side, and then also give an investor's perspective on taxonomies and how important are they, and maybe give some insights about how certainly we would look at ESG in nuclear, which is a topic we have done a lot of thinking about. Obviously, I can only really speak for how we approach things, although I'd like to think that hopefully a lot of the comments I make will be applicable to many other global investors, certainly in the institutional market. So first importantly, we should really just remind ourselves, why should nuclear be interesting to financial investors? I think the first point Paul has made earlier on, which is I think increasingly institutional investors are very focused on the pathway to net zero, the impact of their capital upon climate change and energy transition. And this has been clearly readily demonstrated globally in sectors like renewables, which, if you fast forward to today, has an immense amount of potential demand for those assets because they very much sort of tick a box, as it were, in terms of meeting those requirements of contributing to climate change. So for that reason, when we look at nuclear, it's very important to look at that as a potential opportunity on the basis that it is an important technology towards net zero. Or perhaps I should say that investors want to understand what nuclear's role is within net zero. So some may be in that point, or some may need convincing. Now, the opportunity in the UK has arisen because obviously this is we could, I'm sure, and Paul would love to spend a long time discussing the different financing models of nuclear. Many of you will be aware that there are different models utilised around the globe. The UK is desperately trying to utilise its wider general energy generation policy, which is for private capital to invest into generation, and therefore trying to resist the concept of what I would call more government-based transactions. And if I look at this from a purely investment point of view, nuclear obviously is relatively unusual because it provides a very long-term, potentially inflation-linked cash flows. So as many as you know, once a plant is built, it has a very long life, much longer arguably than investing into other technologies. So therefore, for institutions such as pension funds and insurers, it provides a very long duration, which is very attractive. So my point being, let's not lose sight of the fact that investors are inherently interested in nuclear for those reasons. Now, we also have to look at, why is nuclear different? Why are we having this conversation today as opposed to a conversation about hydrogen or carbon capture usage and storage, etc.? That will be perhaps self-evident to many of you. The first, though, I will be very honest, it is the reputational risk, however you want to phrase that. I sit within a larger public company. Our business in the insurance side is very much focused on the general public, certainly in the UK, and there is intense sensitivity around the reputation of how we act. And the best way to put this across is the investment decision for nuclear for ourselves in any other technology would be an investment and credit risk type assessment. In this case, there's an additional dimension because I can speak quite openly. There is no doubt that our board would be very interested on the basis that we intend to, if we were to be looking at nuclear as an investment in a way that wouldn't be the case in other technologies. So we have to acknowledge it is different, rightly or wrongly. I think there are a number of reasons for that historically. There's also the easier first consideration, which is investment risk. And this goes back to the point about different models. The fact that for the most part, most financings of nuclear has had to be either quasi-sovereign or involve a huge amount of government support. The UK model, as many of you are aware, is slowly but surely moving towards I don't think I'm going too fast to say that it is moving towards a regulated asset-based model for the next new nuclear project, very different to the model used for Hinkley, but that is really an adaptation towards attracting private capital. So what the government's focused on is reducing the investment risk. And for many years, it was very easy for me to go and tell everyone why it was very hard to finance nuclear, because sadly, many developers have failed, and some of you may be offended by this, but many developers have failed to actually be able to deliver nuclear to on time and to budget. So therefore, it represented a huge amount of construction risk, which classically a lot of investors are very nervous about. But also, it is an incredibly large investment. So few technologies would need of the order of anything from 10 to $20 billion type equivalent financings. Now, the last leg in why is it different is this ESG point. Now, certainly from our point of view, we see ESG as integrated to everything we do. It was interesting in Paulina's comments there that I think many banks are in a similar position, but we don't differentiate from what would be a sort of green financing from a non-green financing. Every transaction that we would look at and every asset would be looked at from its ESG perspective. And if we talk about nuclear, and I'm trying to bring this to the sort of practical matter, many of you are aware that typically the sort of those who would challenge the technology internally would normally raise either safety or waste as two areas in particular they're focused and worried about. And what strikes me is that certainly in the financing community, there is a very low base of understanding of the technology, and mainly because they've not had to. And I think this is probably the largest area we need to see changed over time, and is in the UK context is certainly our view to government is that they need to be part of a debate between the industry, financial institutions and government critically to be able to make an asset, bring that to life and support an industry into the long term. So my last few comments on ESG, as I say, it's an integrated process. It has a very much a focus around carbon emissions. I noted the nice graph that Paulina showed there, which is life cycle emissions. That would be something which would be good, a good sort of data source, assessments of climate risk, but also looking at a lot wider, and we shouldn't forget about the S and the G. G we might see as a kind of a hygiene factor, but the S, the impacts on communities, is very important, the impact of construction. But in terms of taxonomies, they are, the last things I'll say, and this probably is a lead into the Q&A, they are a very useful form of standardization. We do not think that they're absolutely necessary because we do our own assessment. However, if a taxonomy is negative, all it does is fuel those who would dissent against the technology. So it really puts us sort of 15 love down in tennis terms against building a case for nuclear. And this is a conversation we've been having with the UK government as we move to looking at the UK version of the EU taxonomy. And certainly the recent announcements on the green finance framework, the UK government has a clear view why it felt that nuclear should be excluded. I think the point we would make, and this is my last comment, what is absolutely fundamental to any financial investor is long-term government support. And we have a slight concern that if a government can't even see itself supported around taxonomy, what does that say about its long-term support? So that may be a segue to some questions, but let me close on that point. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks so much, Daryl. And I think as you closed out your remarks, that does lead us into a couple of questions right away. Before we begin, though, I'd just like to remind all of our attendees that if you do have questions, please use the Q&A. If you're directing them to some of our panelists specifically, we may do some written answers as we go along. So please look for those as well. And obviously we'll try and get to as much as possible and integrate that in some of our discussions. So, maybe we'll start with just the point, Daryl, that you touched on and maybe get a few others to comment is, what happens if the EU in this analysis that Jessica touched on, if the EU does not include nuclear, how fatal is that to ESG investing? And do ESG investors need that, or can they pretty much determine on their own, either individually or collectively, that nuclear is satisfactory and then make their own decisions based on those sorts of views? So maybe Jessica, why don't you start, and then maybe I'll flip it to Fiona for some comments.
Yeah, so thank you. I think the first thing with regards to the taxonomy and its impact is, as I mentioned, the goal of the taxonomy is to direct finance towards sustainable activities. So of course, if nuclear is not in the taxonomy, that means that investors will at some point be discouraged from investing in nuclear because it's not considered taxonomy compliant. The issue is that with the taxonomy regulation, companies and investors are going to have to report on their activities going forward. So they are within the non-financial reporting directive requirements, they are going to have to state as of the 1st of January 2022 that X amount of their investments or their activities are taxonomy compliant and that X amount are not taxonomy compliant. And the goal for the Commission or for the EU is that the share of taxonomy compliant is going to grow over time. So there you can already see that they are trying to discourage money from going to non-taxonomy compliant activities. But there is also the broader political issue. The taxonomy is increasingly being linked to other files. First of all, they're looking to review their state aid guidelines. A lot of member states use state aid to finance nuclear projects. There are suggestions that in future, state aid should be limited to taxonomy compliant activities. This is what some are trying to push for. So that means that if nuclear is out of the taxonomy for political reasons, and the state aid guidelines are reviewed, that means that in future that could put in jeopardy projects that are financed via the state. There's also for looking at it from the private market perspective, you have, for example, in Finland, you have what is known as the Mankala model. So you have the paper industry, which is an investor in the nuclear industry because they get the benefit out of their investment. So they get the energy that they need to produce the paper, etc. There again, because they are going to be obliged to report, because the paper industry is also covered by the taxonomy, this means that they could eventually be discouraging them from investing in nuclear activities and pushing them to put their money towards renewable activities, thereby causing a distortion in the market.
Fiona, some additional thoughts?
I think the challenge with nuclear not being included in the taxonomy actually goes further than that, because we've heard that some European financial institutions will simply refuse to lend to nuclear if it's not included in the taxonomy. And they're not limiting that to, they see it as they won't be allowed to lend to nuclear. Those are the terms that they put forward. And they've gone, and it doesn't just apply to Europe, it applies to anywhere in the world. So those institutions suddenly become they cannot lend to nuclear no matter where that is in the world. That then has all sorts of questions around jurisprudence and the ability of countries to decide their own energy policy, because if they can't get the money from some of the EU institutions, then where are they going to get the money from? Do they have to government fund? It has very wide-ranging implications. I think there's another side to this, which is the energy systems that are included in the taxonomy, the renewables, CCS, etc., are almost getting a clean card to say, yes, they have to report, but you know what, we've checked them out as an asset class, so we'll push them through. We don't really need to investigate them. We don't really need to get them to do proper ESG reporting. And we know with some of the technologies that certainly in the supply chain, there have been issues in the past. You know, there's questions that need to be raised about, we need wind farms, but wind turbines include balsa wood. Is the balsa wood ethically sourced? You know, how is waste being looked at by these other technologies? Are they dealing with it appropriately? We know historically some of the renewables industry haven't dealt with their waste very well, but we are now seeing the solar industry putting in place systems that follow a lot of what nuclear has done for many years, of working out their decommissioning plan, working out how they're going to fund decommissioning and waste management, and actually thinking about this before they enter into these projects. These are questions that should be raised across the board, and we need that level playing field rather than taxonomies saying yes or no.
Babatunde, one of the comments that Daryl made in his final remarks was that, you know, one of the challenges for nuclear projects historically has been the size. And you've focused some of your work on SMRs. Do you see that as being viewed differently by the investment community in terms of just the scale of the project and maybe the construction timeline being shorter? Does that start to address some of the maybe classic equity concerns, maybe in terms of the scale of investment, and also just the time between when the money goes in and when the project starts generating money? Is that a new opportunity maybe in this sector?
Right. Thanks for the question, Paul. In our engagement with the financial community and sustainable finance stakeholders, I think and I think to Daryl's point, let me just first underscore that there's still a gulf in understanding as to the attributes of SMRs, broadly speaking, in the financial community. I think there's much road to be covered in terms of bringing the community up to speed as to what these innovative nuclear reactors actually present and how they address some of the fundamental issues. You talked about the long-standing construction time, construction schedules, et cetera, et cetera. I think what we have observed is that when you have features such as the use of non-water coolants, for instance, with molten salts or molten metal designs, that starts to address the issue that some of the environmentally sensitive investors have in terms of nuclear's water footprint or water consumption. The smaller footprint and the modular nature indeed gives some degree of flexibility and allows for risk to be managed much more easily. So yes, that is indeed directionally positive, to use the language that we have observed in our engagement with financial stakeholders. And yes, these attributes are directionally positive for nuclear. But I think fundamentally, it still has to be a strong business proposition. I think there's still the expectation that the nuclear energy industry still has to demonstrate the fact that indeed the cost can be competitive. Indeed, there can be learning curves that can be achieved with successive deployments of these small modular nuclear reactors. I think those sort of fundamental questions regarding competitiveness still remain, despite the fact that indeed, yes, you do have innovative attributes that make it more attractive relative to the larger nuclear reactor designs. And maybe I'll just touch upon your question that you asked previously about the inclusion in the taxonomy. I mean, if it's not included in taxonomy, that's quite significant. It's not fatal, but I would argue that it is significant. And I want to underscore that in terms of what you see in, the debt capital markets, for instance. I mean, if you take a look at some of the green bond issuance as an example, right? Because fundamentally, this is about access to capital, right? Right. And increasingly, we recognize that capital is going green. So obviously, you're trying to ensure that, nuclear energy is considered to be a quote unquote green asset. Now, if we take a look at green bond issuance, even from utilities that have a significant portfolio of nuclear assets, you see that in some of their issuance, they actually exclude nuclear. And that really has to do with the reputational risks that, Daryl mentioned earlier, and the perception that somehow they lose credibility in the green bond investor landscape if they include nuclear as part and parcel of their use of proceeds. And I think, that really needs to be challenged and to be looked at based on scientific evidence. So the taxonomy and the inclusion of nuclear can go a long way in making it clear that based on the science, indeed, nuclear energy as an asset class is indeed a sustainable economic activity. And I think having harmonization, not just isolated taxonomies, but harmonization across the globe that increasingly recognize nuclear's role as a green asset is also important. So that science-based aspect of the taxonomies and the fact that nuclear's inclusion is quite consequential, particularly when it comes to perception from investors when they're issuing green debt in the form of green bonds, for instance. That is quite an important thing that we need to pay attention to.
Thanks. Helena, you talked about the Akuyu project, and the basis of that project comes from an intergovernmental agreement between Russia and Turkey. And you look at the policies that you mentioned within Russia and having nuclear be part of driving clean energy goals. How do you see those factors driving the decisions of the institutions that are providing financing? Daryl mentioned in his closing remarks about the important role of government in making all this happen. So how do you connect that concept of the role of government and then the specifics of that project where you see things being done at the government to government level, and then we see this investment coming in by the institutions?
Actually, I would say that the official decision is really important. That could be breaking point to move the sector of green financing, of ESG financing forward. So I would say that is a very necessary first step. So we can see that in European Union we still do not have such a decision, so we cannot move forward with the practical cases, practical deals, and in this way. But that is not enough. I would say that for to dealing with banks, dealing with financial institutions, we have to answer a lot of questions in regard of our company ESG performance. So anyway, we need to be ESG compliant as a player. So we have a lot of additional questions together with our regular crediting process, which we go through when we conclude any financial deals. So I would say that this ESG compliance quite a new thing for us as a Russian player, is an international player, and we need this state support, this regulatory support, not only for nuclear industry to be ESG compliant, to be sustainable compliant, but to develop this general regulation framework as for producing sector, as for energy sector, as for financial institutions, financial sector. And I would say that probably the next step should be for our state authorities to go into international discussions to make our sustainable regulation aligned in some way with international ones, because when we're talking about such large projects as nuclear energy power plants, we need to understand that it cannot be just one country decision. It should be a regional decision. It should be aligned with the general country and regional energy strategy. So the very first step now we hopefully, I would say, we hopefully have in Russia that we understand that our state authorities are treat nuclear energy mostly as a sustainable one, as a climate positive, but that is not enough to move forward in a global way. So that's it.
Thank you very much. Daryl, we wanted to touch a bit on sort of different types of investing. I mean, when you look at SMRs right now, we see that the money is really going into technology development more so than anything else. But at the end of the day, technology development's lovely, but that doesn't mean there are going to be any projects. So how do we move from, if we want nuclear to do all the things that we're talking about during this webinar, all these aspirations, how do we move from technology development to project delivery and project development? How do we mobilize this capital at the project level? And, you know, let's say that the EU does make nuclear part of the taxonomy. Let's say that the ESG community says, yes, nuclear counts. We still need good projects, right? I mean, at someday, it's still a project, as complicated as it may be, the unique factors of nuclear that you've mentioned, we still need good projects. So what does that mean to you from your perspective?
Yeah. I think it's a really good point, Paul, because obviously we're layering ESG on top of a lot of challenges already in the sector in terms of the technology. And, you know, let's not forget, sort of very simplistically, a lot of financial investors are most concerned around technology risk and long-term revenue risk. So in various countries around the world, governments have sought to actually mitigate some of those risks. I think for me, though, if you look at the life cycle of technology, leaning quite heavily on SMRs, I think Tunde got it absolutely right, which is, I think there is no other route through having governments heavily support early on. I mean, I've been quite vocal in a UK context that the about to be formed UK Infrastructure Bank, I've said actually the gap in the market, certainly in Europe today, is in early stage development. And my view is, and Tunde illustrated this, I have a very strong view why you don't see that private equity, venture capital, because those guys tend to feel that they can control their own destiny. And I'm not sure you would argue they can do that with technologies like nuclear. It needs too much around in terms of government policy and other supporting mechanisms. So I think for those reasons, I would like to see government really pump prime the sector. And then you start to bring in progressively more capital. We all know that once we're at if you're in construction, I talked about the regulated asset base. If you are willing to mitigate that risk, and let's be open, that means sharing that with the consumer in the case of the UK, then actually you can open up quite very large amounts of capital. But in a way, what I see is private capital will sort of grow exponentially. Once you have an operating plant with a reasonable offtake arrangement, that looks like many other energy sources, that becomes very attractive to classical long-term institutional investment. So in a way, I think for any government developing nuclear, they just have to match the stages of the life cycle of development of those assets with the capital that's available.
Fiona, you mentioned that you and I are both recovering project finance lawyers. So any further thoughts on, you know, the importance of putting together a good project to make this happen? You know, even if we check all the boxes that nuclear qualifies, I mean, you know, based on the space that you and I used to live in, what does this mean to you in terms of good projects?
I think the challenge we've seen with a lot of the large projects is the amount of capital needed, but also the risk sharing profile. So in classic project finance terms, like push the risk down to the supply chain just doesn't work, because there will bankrupt companies if it goes wrong. So there has to be the risk sharing across the project, and you share the good and the bad. And I think it's important that we set these projects up to share risk. We don't try and push it further and further down the supply chain, because we will bankrupt companies that surely cannot be ESG compliant in any way. We need to, as Daryl said, bring government into the early projects, with them taking some of the risk and them trying to de-risk these projects. But I think with small reactors, as Tunde said, it becomes easier, particularly if we're looking at manufacturing in factories rather than long on-site construction projects. I think that very much changes the balance of how we build these technologies, how we set them up as projects, and should actually make the financing easier. I think the other thing we need to consider is making sure that our approach is proportionate. It fascinates me that $2 billion of private finance, largely from private equity, has gone into the fusion market, but we can't get it into the fission market. And when you talk to some of those investors, they're very clear it's because the regulation that has been seeped onto nuclear on top of each other, on top, the multiple layers causes so many problems for them that it makes it very hard for companies to be proportionate, to set their projects up in a proportionate manner, and to bring these projects forward. Whereas fusion regulation is being looked at almost from a clean sheet and saying, what do we need? Yes, there might be some radioactive waste, but so does the airline industry, so do hospitals, so do, et cetera, et cetera. You can look at so many industries that produce radioactive waste and how do they manage it? So being proportionate, I'm not, let me be clear, saying that we should get rid of our regulation and we should leave it to industry. I think the regulation of nuclear is very important, but it needs to be proportionate, and the risk sharing needs to be proportionate as well.
How much money are we talking about here? I mean, if we get the taxonomy right and we get the ESG investors on board, what is the amount of money that you see coming into this sector? And is it symbolic? Is this sort of something that people say, well, I'll put a little bit of money in, but it's not going to be transformative? Or do you see the amount of money being critical to the success of nuclear and thus being transformative for the sector?
Right. To your point, in terms of money, I think this is really about access to money. To try and put a dollar figure on it. I mean, green bonds in 2020, for instance, issuance, cumulative issuance, exceeded $1 trillion, right? So they're in the $1 trillion realm now, and the growth that we're seeing, especially being accelerated with a renewed sort of consciousness about ESG related investment the pandemic has enabled. We see that growth in green bonds, for instance, accelerating. And then you have new kinds of instruments like sustainability linked bonds that are, focused more on the key performance indicators that are sort of impact oriented and not, tied in or constrained by, the use of proceeds model with green bonds where they have to be allocated to a quote unquote green project. Whereas in the case of instruments such as sustainable linked bonds or sustainable linked loans, essentially you're looking at leaving it to the issuer to decide how they actually meet those key performance indicators. So that is also seeing significant growth. I guess the essence of my response is that, this is fundamentally about access. Putting a specific figure on it is difficult, but it's fast growing. And for all indications in the financial realm, green finance will just simply be finance in the long term. So having access to that pot of capital is really important. And I think there's a lot to be, it's consequential given the fact that, like I mentioned earlier, you're talking about getting an SMR project to the point of commercialization, up to $1 billion in technology development, costs. And you're not even talking about the first of a kind construction, right? And then you're not talking about, in the case of SMRs, where you need multiple units to be deployed to take advantage of economies of scale, we're talking about significant capital requirements here. So access to that green pot is important.
Yeah, and we're at the end of the 90 minutes. There's maybe one or two more questions I'd like to address that have come through. Could we run a little bit long? Is that okay? All right, I'm getting a head nod, so we'll just do a few more, and then I'll pass it back to you. Jessica, there's been a ton of questions that have come through about the taxonomy, and we're just not talking enough about the EU taxonomy. So I'm going to hand it to you to make everybody happy and answer all these questions that are coming in. So one of the things I think that was brought up in one of the remarks was, you know, there's a lack of understanding. So how can we address maybe the lack of understanding, you know, in this debate about nuclear and getting fair treatment for nuclear in terms of its legacy and life cycle issues and equitable treatment relative to what seems to be ignored elsewhere. There seems to be some questions saying, well, nuclear doesn't manage its waste responsibly. Personally, I would say it's properly funded and stored. But, you know, I'm sure that's a whole nother webinar. So, and then of course, just the politics of it all, that it seems like there are some countries that may say, this isn't for me, but they don't stop there. It's a, this isn't for me and I don't want you to do it either. Instead of saying, well, I choose not to, but if you want to and you can do it in a responsible way, that's okay. So, you know, trying to wrap that all into some sort of a comment towards the end of this session, you know, where do you see things in terms of getting nuclear to have its day in the sun in terms of this taxonomy debate and the ESG debate?
Hi, Paul. Yes, so I'll try and answer all of that in a short statement. I think one thing that we need to make clear with all of this, okay, we've basically got, what, 30 years to decarbonize our economy in a sustainable way. So the starting point of the taxonomy was a good starting point. Yes, let's make sure we're putting our money in the right technologies. But what we have been saying from the very start is the best way to assess whether a technology or not is sustainable is to come up with the criteria first, and then assess each technology against that criteria within the same sector. So for example, let's look at the volume of raw materials required per technology to generate a certain amount of energy. Let's look at the amount of land that's required. Let's look at how much waste is generated, be it non-recyclable waste, be it radioactive waste, be it toxic or hazardous waste. These are all criteria that are very, very valid criteria. But what for us is key is if you're going to have an accurate assessment, you need to decide the criteria first and then apply them to the different technologies. Because at the end of the day, let's be quite honest, the only energy source that has zero impact is the one which we don't use. All energy sources have some form of impact or another. The regulation itself, in a way, supports the inclusion of nuclear under the taxonomy, because the regulation says that the assessments need to be based on the principle of technology neutrality. So they support this point about get the criteria first and then apply it in the same way. The problem is it's become a political issue. And so what's happened is that there's been some who said, right, we want these technologies in and we want these technologies out. So we're going to adapt the criteria on a case-by-case basis in order to achieve our goal. So it has to already be said that with regards to the technical experts group, we have to give them a lot of credit because they said we don't have the right expertise. And given the issue, we need experts to assess it. The experts have assessed it, and the experts have overall concluded that nuclear is taxonomy compliant in the same way that the other technologies are taxonomy compliant. As you point out, at EU level, each member state is free to select its own energy mix. There are some member states who don't support nuclear, and therefore, whilst they cannot effectively ban another member state from using nuclear, they are trying to use EU policies to restrict that nuclear as far as possible. But what for us is key today, and this is a message that came out from members of the European Parliament in a letter that they sent to the Commission. I think I shared it in the Q&A. They've made it really clear. The EU needs to respect the science, because that is the only way that we are going to achieve what we want to achieve. And it's the only way that investors are going to have confidence in these taxonomies. Because if we're putting forward taxonomies that are not based on the science and are simply based on the political ideology of certain member states, then investors are not going to trust those taxonomies and they are simply going to ignore them. And I think this is what we need to make very clear. And it's something, again, one other point that I wanted to add just very quickly. In the discussion with the European Parliament last week, questions were raised, for example, the issue of lithium mining for batteries. Why is nothing being said about lithium mining? And there the Commission answered in a very honest way. The reason they're not looking at how lithium is being mined is simply because the data is not available. So here again, we find ourselves in a situation that the nuclear industry has all these controls in place. There are all these regulations in place. And yet, in a way, we're being hampered by them because others that simply don't have that information available are in a way being allowed to be included on the taxonomy as a result. And this comes back again to this clear point. Assess all the technologies against the same criteria. And that is how you will ensure that you have a taxonomy that is suitable to its requirements.
I'll just wrap up with two very quick ones. First one to Paulina. Rosatom's involved in projects all over the world, and we've been focused on the EU taxonomy, but just very briefly, what are you seeing outside of Europe and projects that you're working on in terms of the views towards the taxonomy issues and ESG issues with regard to the views in some countries outside of Europe?
Actually, that depends on the region pretty much, because there are still many countries that just thinking about their climate strategy, and they did not still put any net zero goals. So that depends, to my opinion, on the urgency of the climate challenge and climate obligations. Also, so this ESG compliance, sustainability compliance, it is more relevant to the European region, I would say, because and probably for the United States, where the financing instruments that are quite developed and quite already linked with all these green and sustainability issues. But on the other hand, if you do not take the financing issues itself, I would say that almost in every country in the world, and we currently build our power plants in 12 countries. So we see the huge interest in regard and the huge request in regard of ESG compliance in general, because we see some requirements in regard of social issues and social responsibility of our performance, in regard of locals, in regard of guaranteeing biodiversity and the safety of ecosystems. So we see there are a lot of very different ESG requests in regard of each country. So, but somewhere we do have already some ESG regulation, and that is called like ESG, but sometimes it is still about general environmental issues. It is about their social policy, national social policy, and so on and so forth. So we're trying to recognize all these, all our general framework that we used to have in regard of our construction of nuclear power plant projects in different countries. and we're trying to combine it in our country, like some kind of number of ESG practices, just to share them in between our international and Russian projects. So I would say that ESG rules, they're spreading worldwide.
Thank you. Daryl, you were the last speaker, so I'll give you the last word. I wanted to just hit something that we haven't talked on at all, and burden you with this one. We've seen the oil and gas majors under heavy attack by institutional investors. And we've seen some of them moving away from being oil companies to energy companies, but we don't see them screaming at the mountaintops that they're going to be putting tons of money into nuclear. Is there a reason for that? And do you see that possibly changing as we move forward?
I think many will know that there's probably a number of reasons for that. I guess they typically like to have large elements of control over what they're doing. So without if I leap forward, a potential model is to replace, and I'm speaking here from a European perspective, we are obviously facing a demise of large-scale utilities as the developer of nuclear. And there's no doubt, certainly my experience in Europe, is we've moved to much more of a vendor-focused model. One thing that many will be clear on is vendors do not have huge amounts of capital to invest in the same way as utilities did in Europe many, many years ago. So there's an interesting dynamic there, which is perhaps more of a, in my mind, a feasible model is why couldn't an oil major go in tandem with a technology provider? Maybe that's just seen as too difficult by them. I think that is a feasible model. It's interesting when we look at other technologies, whether it be carbon capture and storage or even EV charging, everyone seems to be, a lot of governments, certainly the UK government, pinning a lot of hope on those oil majors to bring that capital and that shift, as we've seen in renewables. So I think there's a model there, but I think it's about finding the right partnership, probably with a vendor technology provider will be my answer. Possibly in the SMR going forward could be viable.
See, there you go. And Deanne's smiling already because she's got the wrap up, and maybe we can see Canadian mining companies teaming up with vendors and then showing the oil and gas majors how it's done. So there you go. But before I throw it back to Deanne, I just want to thank all of our panelists for just amazing comments, and thank you for addressing the questions. I apologize to our audience. We couldn't get to all the questions. I tried to sort of bundle them up to address as many as we could, but thank you so much for sticking with us for a few extra minutes so that we could try to address as many as we could. So again, thank you all, both the panelists and our attendees, and Deanne, back to you.
Thanks so much, Paul, and also to our panelists today. This was a very interesting discussion, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface. I'm going to recap a couple of the key themes and points that I heard that really sort of jumped out at me. Paul started us out with a very good challenge question, which is, as countries are planning their economic recovery policies and investments, the key question is how best to deploy those funds. Labels are important. Categorization matters. Metrics, this idea is so important. Metrics should be applied consistently with similar levels of scrutiny across technology options. Efficiency, the economic efficiency of the outcome is best achieved when policies and metrics are technology neutral and are based on the desired outcomes. That's such a fundamental principle in policymaking, broadly speaking, but it needs to be central to these financial policy debates that are happening. There is a gap. There's a number of gaps actually, but there's a gap between the stated ambitions and the investment flows. There's also a gap, I think, between the science dialogue and the public and political dialogue. Which is a very difficult one to tackle. We all talk about evidence-based policy making, but we see also some evidence of the opposite, which one could call policy-based evidence making. there's no easy solution here, and that's part of what makes a public and political debate on this challenging, because there are some real trade-offs that need to be considered, and that requires systems level thinking, and there's a complexity to all of this. Nuclear, from the science, we know that nuclear is needed and nuclear has an important role to play, but we also know that nuclear faces many challenges, including reputational risks. We cannot build or repair public confidence, which underpins perceived political risks. We cannot build or repair public confidence without actually talking to the public. We need to have these difficult conversations with the citizenry. And that's not an easy task. Science communication, complexity communication, these are challenging things, but we invite you to continue discussing with us in these webinar series. We'll resume again in September with discussions on incentives design and contract design. But then I think another event that will build a lot of momentum from today's discussion, we'll have a webinar on the role of development finance and climate finance in nuclear new build in the context of global ambitions around climate change. And all of this building momentum to our in-person events, hopefully at COP26, but then also in Warsaw next year for our finance workshop. So just a huge thank you to everybody for really excellent presentations and excellent discussion today. I know I learned a lot, and I thank you again, and I wish you all the best. See you at our next event. Thank you, everyone.